honor the memory of Ed Wood Sr., as you know. And I see a lot of relatives here. He was a father to some of us and uncle to others and so on. And we've got a monument with some plaques on it that we're going to be unveiling as soon as I get done talking. So I thought I'd give you some of the highlights of his life as a citizen of Rainier, and then we'll have the unveiling, and then we'll go back up on the hill and eat. This statue was essentially the last thing he did for Rainier, and this was in 1983, 31 years ago. So many of you people do not have a historical memory of the things he did before that. I guess you might say that this was sort of the icing on the cake, and some of you already know the story about the statue, but I'll repeat it for posterity's sake. Back in 1973, when Voyager National Park was formed, Vic Davis, who grew up in Rainier, Vic Jr., had land right across from where the park visitor center is, across the bay, and he felt, Vic did, that the park gave him a low-ball offer for his land and that they were arrogant, etc. And so just to, and I'm going to use a term here in the colloquial sense of the word, just to pimp the park, he brought in this statue and put it up on his island, and it made them very angry. So to make a long story short, they ended up in litigation and so on, and by 1980 or 1981 the litigation was over. Vic got a much fairer price for his land, at least he felt he did, and he's the one who told me this story, so I'm just repeating what he told me. They could hardly wait, the park could hardly wait to take the statue down, so they took it down and laid it in the bush by the visitor center, and it was at that point that our dad, Ed Wood Sr., came into the picture, and he thought, historically, he knew that in the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s, the Voyageurs used to stop. This was one of their main stops where Rainier now is. They would stop and trade for beaver furs, muskrat furs, wolf furs, and so on, and wild rice, that sort of thing, with the natives. They would powwow for several days before continuing their journey down Rainy River to Lake of the Woods, up to Hudson Bay, and so on. So that went on for hundreds of years, and so he thought, hey, he can take this thing that became kind of a joke and make something more real out of it. So he went up to the park and bought it for $1. And they could hardly wait to get rid of it. He brought it back to Rainier, where it sat on the Rainier Hill where we're going to be going to eat lunch. It sat up there on its side for a year. There's even pictures of my kids climbing on this thing. But always he wanted to put it right here as an entrance to Rainier, as a historical Voyager where so much of it took place. So Eddie, my brother here, he was a cement man, much like our dad was. He's the one who put this concrete base in 31 years ago. Eddie also did the concrete work on the monument that you're about to see. That'll be unveiled as soon as I get done talking. But like I say, this was the icing on the cake. He had done so much before that. So I'm going to go back a little bit of the history of Ed Woods and his family. Rainier was like a second family to him. He loved this town, and he was always devoted to it, and he never looked for personal gain. He always wanted to do what he thought was best for Rainier. In the course of his many decades here, he rankled a few feathers, some of whom I see in the group today. But he had his ways about him, yeah, and he could be irritating, but always he wanted, at least in his view, what was best for Rainier. I ran across a quote the other day from an ancient Roman poet, philosopher, statesman who lived over 2,000 years ago, named Virgil. And the quote is, and I thought this was apropos for today, "The noblest motive is the public good. And I believe that our dad, Ed Wood Sr., certainly lived up to that motive, even though he had never heard of Bergen, I'm sure. Prior to, a long time before this statue, when he first came to Rainier at the height of the Depression in the 1930s, and he brought his mother, Betsy Woods, our grandmother. He brought his sisters came, Avis, Mary Jane, Audrey, and his youngest brother, Bernard, who I'm named after, but whose nickname was Beans. They scrabbled out a living. He always wanted to be a contractor. He was a cement guy. He could do plumbing. He could do carpentry work. But he was talented in those areas, although he never had a formal education, other than graduating from high school in Detroit Lakes. So they came up here, they scrabbled out a living. He met our mother, who was born here in Rainier, lived in Rainier her whole life, and died in Rainier in 2008. They got married in 1940, and it was shortly after, not too long after they got married, that World War II broke out. He always wanted to have a contracting firm of his own, a contracting crew. And, you know, money was tough, times were tough, and so he managed to make a living. But after World War II broke out, his youngest brother, Beans, joined the Army and met Paul Swenson, Susan's dad, in the Army, and they ended up getting in on all the fighting in North Africa with Patton's army and into Sicily, and eventually ended up in Anzio on the mainland of Italy, where Beans was killed. And Paul was spared, but Paul was nearby when it happened. And Paul, of course, spent the rest of his life in Rainier, too, after the war was over. Dad felt this need to take his brother's place. By that time, he was in his 30s. He already had 2 kids, and I was on the way. But he felt this obligation that he owed to his community, to his country, and so he joined the infantry. He was sent to Europe, where he fought in France, fought in Belgium, fought in Luxembourg, and on into Germany, crossed the Rhine River, and the Russians were closing in on the other side. Finally, at the Elbe River, and I'm going to tell you sort of a funny story here that he told me when I was a teenager. He said there they were at the Elbe, and it looked like the war would be over soon, and Germany was in the last throes of its ability to fight back. And these photographers from Time and Life and Look magazine were there for the meeting of the Russians and the Americans before the final battles for Germany. And Dad said that this officer came along and was picking out people from his unit to meet the Russians, because there was going to be a handshake, and it was going to make all the major media outlets here in the United States. So Dad said, here this officer started going through all these guys, and he'd say, I want you, and you, and you, and you, but he never pointed at Dad. Well, it turned out that all the people that were supposed to meet the Russians had to be over 6 feet tall, so they would look bigger than the Russians. And Dad was only about 5'8", so he never qualified. He used to get a big chuckle out of that. And it was not too long after that, in the final throes of this war, that our dad, along with his unit, was captured by the Germans. He again told me later on in life, and he was reluctant to talk about the war, like many veterans were. He told me that later on, he figured that that was the end for them, because the Germans had no food, they were desperate themselves, there was all this chaos, and he said they were marched up and down in this little valley for a week or 10 days, waiting for the end. You know, they thought that they would be slaughtered by the Germans. But he said it was the luck of the draw that the Germans, as it turns out, were aware that the Russians treated German prisoners prisoners very, very bad because of what the Germans had done to the Russians. So he figured that these Germans wanted to surrender to the Americans where they would be treated well, and if they had prisoners and surrendered, that the Americans would treat them, treat them with much better than the Russians would. So that's what happened. He came back at the end of the war, back to Rainier, still with the idea of forming his own construction crew, and always he wanted to bring water to Rainier, because when he had first come here in the 1930s, he noticed that some people didn't have water. Many of the people of Rainier were quite poor. Some people who lived along the lake and the river, they did have water, but they would frequently have problems. You know, they ran their lines out into the lake or the river, and the lines would silt up, or boat anchors would pull them, or they would freeze up. Inland, some people had water, but there was a lot of bedrock in Rainier. So, those who did have water, though, had a lot of minerals in it. And if you drank the water, it had a distinct taste. And if you washed clothes or dishes with it, it would leave the clothes stained and take away the whiteness and so on. And a lot of people who lived on bedrock didn't have water at all. There was a water truck that would come to town once a week or whatever and fill up water barrels, 50-gallon barrels that people had. Some of the people couldn't even afford that. They would end up going to the lake with buckets and bringing the water. And he started, during the 1940s, started keeping maps of Rainier. He would get plat maps and put down, when he learned the substructure of Rainier, he would note it on his maps, because he knew in the back of his mind that he wanted to get water for Rainier. So eventually, in the late 1940s, Dad acquired a concrete block machine that made one block at a time, and they could make 700 blocks a day. He hired a crew of 4, and he had a big cement mixer that went with the block machine, and his dream then, besides water, was to open up the eastern part of Rainier, right over here, which was all woods and some swamp and brush. So he opened up Pine Street, he opened up the street over here, he had his crew cut down the trees, and his dream was to complete the loop and have houses on both sides of the street. With his cement blocks, he managed to build, in the 1950s, 3 cement block houses and 1 stick-built home on Pine Street. This is over near the rink, where the rink is now. And then, and plus he sold blocks to the public, plus he put in a lot of foundations in International Falls, up the lake, and so on. So he always had a lot of work to do. And in the by the way, the cement block homes are still there, only you wouldn't know it because they're all covered with siding now. But in the mid-1950s, what happened was, for him, economically disastrous, because a block company in Virginia, Minnesota had modern equipment. They could make thousands of blocks per day. They could send them up to International Falls and sell them cheaper than my dad could. So that put him out of the block business. So he was back to working by himself, hiring people when he needed to, when he got work. He had a good relationship with other contractors who had equipment, such as Tony Root, Ernie Johnson, George St. Peter, Ivan Keeney. They would bring in their dozers or their backhoes when he had to dig a basement or do concrete work of some sort. And they became very friendly to him. And he would always tell them, anytime you got extra dirt, clean, filled, bring it out to Rainier, I'll show you where to dump it. Never on his own property, but always to improve the roads and stuff, which were gravel and very, the only paved road at that time was a street that went through town. So he was always working on that. Then, in the winter of 1951-52, he decided to act on his own to see what he could do about bringing water to Rainier. So in the off-season, in the winter, he took a trip to St. Paul on a bus, stayed in a cheap hotel, got out the phone book, looked for engineering firms, started visiting them with his bag full of maps of Rainier, and he was turned down at several of them. To hear him tell it, they laughed him out of the joint. Water for Rainier, you know, this little town that's miles from nowhere. But he found somebody who was as much of a dreamer as he was, and the guy's name was Robert Ellison, who had the civil engineering firm. And like our dad, not only was Bob Ellison a dreamer, but he was also a doer, and he had the same determination that our dad had. So he made the trip up here at my dad's request. They spent days going around Rainier, the two of them, studying the maps, looking to see where the water line should go, and so on. They worked very well together. And finally, Dad had introduced them to all the council members to set the table to bring in water to Rainier from International Falls. So, Bob Ellison made a presentation to the council. The council told him to go ahead and draw up plans, and for the next 2 years, Bob Ellison finished the plans. Finally, in 1954, Bob Ellison came back to Rainier with the plan completed, gave a pitch to the Rainier Council, and the Rainier Council was in favor of getting water, but they were afraid that they would bankrupt the town because it would cost too much to bring in water from International Falls, 3 miles for the main. And so the council reluctantly passed it up, and it looked like water for Rainier was over. But Dad never forgot it. It was always in the back of his mind. Then in 1955, Rainier at that time, and some of you who are older would remember this, had a dump that's over where the skating rink is now. And that dump had been sitting there since the early 1900s. People had thrown pans, bottles, tires, anything you can imagine was there. We were always warned as kids to stay away from there because it was dangerous. He looked at that and saw a real positive thing for the community. To turn it into a hockey rink, a pleasure rink, and a sliding hill. So he approached the Rainier Recreation Club with this idea, and he said, I know we don't have much money, but we can get volunteers to do the work, and I'll go around and see if I can get people to donate materials. The Rainier Recreation Club went for it because there was a lot of kids in Rainier. They had a lot of kids, and 5 of the members of the Rainier Recreation Club, of course, were also on the council. So they said, yeah. So Dad took me on several of these trips where he looked for donations. He went to the phone company. They donated telephone poles for lights. He went to the railroad. They donated railroad ties to serve as vertical posts for the boards that would make the hockey rink. He went to the Phillips 66 Gas Oil Company, and they donated a big underground storage tank that Dad had Willie Halverson, who's of course dead, also. Willie Halverson was a local mechanic and welder. He cut hundreds of holes in this huge tank. He got these other contractors with equipment such as Tony Rood and George St. Peter and the others that I've mentioned to do the work. They brought in the big equipment. Dad never owned the big equipment. He always hired out. So they volunteered their labor. Many of the people in town volunteered their labor to cut trees off the side of the hill to make a sliding hill. And other people donated lumber. The lumber company sold lumber at cost to them. It was done on a shoestring budget. But when they got finished in the fall, they started in the fall of 1955, that rink, the pleasure rink, the hockey rink, the sliding hill were an instant success. Hundreds of people would go there frequently. The rink was open every day from the time school got out, 4 o'clock, till 9 o'clock at night. On weekends it was open from 9 in the morning till 9 at night. During vacations it was open from 9 in the morning till 9 at night. Dad bought a skate sharpening machine and sharpened thousands of pairs of skates that the kids would have, many of whom were poor. over the years. He was the caretaker in the winter, and this large underground tank, the village had donated the water hoses from their defunct water department, and many's the time that he would call on me to help him flood every week or 10 days. My reward was a couple of candy bars afterwards. But he was the caretaker for many years, coal-fired stove, and it was such a good deal for the community. Kids from Point O'Pines, from Jameson Edition, French Edition would all skate here. Many hockey players were produced here, including a couple of my brothers and myself who ended up, and others who ended up playing for the Broncos over the years. So the rink, which had been a dump, was now the center of community activity in the wintertime. It was wonderful. Then in 1957, the beach, which we all used in the summertime, but we only used about the first 30 feet of it. That was all we could use because the beach was largely undeveloped. He took it upon himself to propose that he would do the work, clear the brush, prevent erosion from the street, which, you know, went down into the beach sand. And he built the retaining wall. You know the one I'm talking about. He built that in 1957, and it's still there today. And every time I drive by and I see people sitting on the retaining wall and enjoying the beach, which was now much bigger than it had been, I still think of Dad. Then, and I'm coming to the final point here, he always had water in the back of his mind. In the late 1950s, around 1960, he had this idea that, as far as I know, has never been done in the history of Minnesota. He started going to all the homes in French and Jameson Edition and having meetings with the people there. And he would say, "Do you want water?" And almost without exception, they said, "Yeah." And he said, "Okay, here's the deal. Each of you has to put up $350 in escrow." And he said, if by 1961 the council turns us down, you'll get your money back. So out of those, and keep in mind, the $350 in 1960, let's say, is the equivalent of like $5,000 or more today. And all these people put up their money. Many, many thousands of dollars. When that was presented to the council, and of course Dad had stayed in contact with Ellison, and he said, "Polish up the plans. I think it's a goal." The council adopted it. In 1961, they said, "Go ahead." They appointed our dad superintendent. Ellison had the plans brought up to date. The bids were let out in July of 1961. The bid was awarded at the end of July, and work started on August 1st, 1961. August, September, October, November, and some of you remember all the blasting for bedrock and everything that had to be done around here. By the way, everybody in Rainier was guaranteed water for the same price, bedrock or no bedrock. They were all guaranteed water. By 1962, the water line was largely complete. Property values went up overnight. It made Rainier property much more valuable now that we had water. In the years to follow, because of the work that had been done with water, and by the way, no state funds or federal funds were available for water. It was all financed. But the water line paid off in spades. Rainier started making money off the people in French and Jameson, and eventually the water line was extended up the lake here. And it set the stage for sewer to come years later, and natural gas, street improvements. Dad always worked on improving the streets. More homes were built in Rainier, and we were able to hire people, people that could do the lawn care and stuff that had been not done in previous years. It helped to make Rainier the community it is today. So when I say that this is the icing on the cake, this is just a small part of what he did. And it makes for a nice entrance to Rainier. But his whole life was spent making Rainier, as he saw it, a better place. And that's pretty much the synopsis. And now, Eddie, if you...
Okay.
By the way, while Eddie's doing that, I'm going to tell you one more thing. During the course of my life as an adult, when I would come back to visit, Dad would say to me on more than one occasion that he had this high school English teacher. And he said something in class one day that Dad never forgot. And that was, the evil that men do lives after them. The good they do is oft interred with their bones. A few months ago, I looked up to where that quote came from. And it was Shakespeare's play in the late 1500s called Julius Caesar, Act 2, Scene 3. And I hope by this small thing that we're doing here that the memory of our dad will stay on for many years to come.
Yay.
Ed, do you want to read that out loud to everyone?
Edmund C. Wood Sr., 1913 to 1996. Three-time mayor, water commissioner, World War II POW, and a civic-minded citizen. He brought our town water, built homes, developed parks, streets, ice rinks, and the village beach. He donated and erected the historical Voyager statue here as his gift for the people of our community. He loved Rainier and spent decades working hard to make it even better. Although he's gone, the good he did lives on.
Lunch up on the hill, and by the way, although this wasn't in the paper the other day, I made a whole bunch of copies of the drawing that I did, where my dad's face is up above the sign here, the billboard, and I'm going to give a free one to everyone who wants it when we go up on the hill to eat. Just tell me if you want one, and I'll sign it for you and date it for you. So let's go up on the hill and enjoy the fine lunch that Wayne, my brother-in-law, made with our mother's recipe on Sloppy Joe's. A sibling picture of the Woodses over here by the thing. But go ahead up on the hill. Everything's ready to go.
Good
job, Eddie.
We're going to get a picture. Oh, yeah, you go ahead. I'll get it right back. Okay.
I'll go with you. And you?
Can you say cheese or what?
Yeah, I can't get Mom.
Can't see it, Pam.
Take mine.